The Saxons in patch 2, price reductions all across the board. Elite Nordic Spearmen, 30 bonus against large. Elite Dugget Spearmen, 20 bonus against large. Must be an oversight. It now makes the Elite Duggets of very questionable utility as an anti-cavalry unit. Especially considering their missile block chance is as poor as it is. Now, there isn't really much else to say about the Saxons. Well, one interesting thing about the Saxons is that they have both heroic cavalry and Nordic horse lords. They also have the Saxon Mounted warband, which isn't horrible. It just has the same attack against cavalry now as the Germanic Horse. So, these Nordic horse lords also just a 20 attack against cavalry now, and that is problematic for them, especially considering how powerful the noble Germanic, the noble Alani are. Really, what's kind of special about the Saxon roster is that they have the essential Nordic units, but their Hearthguard is cheaper than the Hirdmen of the other Nordic factions. They also have the cheap Saxon spears, but thing is though, they have some elite skirmishers, but I wouldn't bother with any of these skirmishers, to be honest. They are very expensive. Although 12 ammunition is nice. So they have the Nordic Horse Lords, and the Nordic Horse Lords are now, because they can't just get spammed by Germanic Horse, they are very, very powerful units, able to do well against the Germanic, noble Germanics. And what they can do now is they can give them a few upgrades, then they are cost the same as the Germanics. You can of course not have the cavalry general, which is too bad for the Nordic, for the Saxons. But the heroic cavalry now is a fairly interesting unit, because the heroic cavalry, the Saxons can field 8 elite melee cavalry units, and not many factions other than the Vandals and the Alans can do that now. Bring 8 heavy, good, sturdy melee cavalry units, and this is enough to win battles for. And again, this is assuming a limit of 8 cavalry units. It's going to change if you can bring more or less cavalry, of course. So you can have the very sturdy Hearthguard that is cheaper, and in my opinion, this means that the Saxons are stronger than the other Nordic factions because they can bring more melee cavalry. Now the difference isn't massive, sure, it isn't huge, but if you bring these 8 melee cavalry units for the Saxons, you can, for example, support them with Nordic Axe Warriors. That is one option. You can support them with Hearthguard. You can bring in some Nordic band speed bombs. You can bring in some Nordic pikemen. You have the funds to do quite a few different things there. You can support with spears if you want, or you can bring a few skirmishers. To the Nordic bows at 100 are very cheap, so you can bring in a few. You can bring in a few of those, or you can bring in a few Nordic hurlers. The Saxons have a bit more flexibility now that it's viable to bring 8 of these elite melee cavalry units, and they don't have to contend with the Germanic horsemen. That was a significant indirect buff of the Saxons, and makes the Saxons one of the stronger Nordic factions, in my opinion. Nordic warriors, you can also bring a bunch of Nordic warriors. If you can bring a very strong melee army with the Saxons. So you can, for example, have Nordic bands for speed bump duty, and then you can have Nordic warriors for a bit of precursors, the Hearthguard, shield wall, and then the Nordic horse lords and the heroic cavalry will be your wrecking balls. So Saxons, out of the Nordic factions, the Saxons, I think, came pretty well out of patch 2. simply for having the extra elite cavalry, elite heroic cavalry unit. And keep in mind though that this is assuming that most tournaments or competitive games, and indeed quick battles, will limit the amount of a unit that you can bring down to 6. Sometimes 4, but usually 6. So of course, if it was 8 or 10, you could just bring 10 Nordic Horse Lords. Then you can bring Nordic Warlord and just stack up on Hearthguard and Nordic Band, and that would be a stronger army, of course. But if we're going to take into consideration that you need to bring a certain balance of units, you can't just bring as many of a single unit as you want, then something like it being more viable to bring 6 Nordic Horse Lords and 2 heroic cavalry is something that's going to make a faction stronger under those particular rules. Now, if we remove those rules, then it doesn't matter much anymore. But this is assuming, it's always going to be assuming that there are some limitations to what you can bring. So that's why I never talk about artillery, for example, or why I always never bring more than 6 of the same unit, because then it's just a matter of having the most cost-effective unit and spamming the most of the most cost-effective units. It's still about spamming the highest amount you can of any cost-effective unit. It's just that the spam is limited by the amount of units that you can bring. So the Saxons definitely came out stronger because other factions were indirectly nerfed, in my opinion. Nordic Horse Raiders, Saxon Mounted Warband. The Saxon Mounted Warband now actually has a bigger bonus against lords than Germanic Horse, so Germanic Horse are completely out of the picture. The new thing is Noble Germanic, and more specifically Noble Alani. Noble Alani is, or more especially Noble Alani. Noble Alani is super hard to deal with now with other cavalry units. You can do a lot of damage to it with shock cavalry, but any half-decent player is going to know not to head on shock cavalry with its Noble Alani. Try to stop them first in some way. Strength and honor.